everyone. In this video we're going to go through the solutions of the term 1 first test, so the tech-free one. You were allowed your bound reference, but just remember that if it's usually tech-free, there's no bound reference allowed, but you were allowed it for this one. Okay, so very first question, find the rule for the inverse of the function, blah, blah, blah. So I'm just going to highlight things because the solutions are already there. So remember, when you're finding the inverse, you're just switching x and y, which we've done so here. And then we just want to make y the subject. So okay, hopefully that gets rid of that. Okay, so just going through each step. All right, just take your time. Now, two errors that students were making. So when you wanted to get rid of this square root sign, you squared. So when you square this negative, it does actually disappear. Okay, so make sure that that does go. Otherwise, if you leave it there, it is incorrect unless it's a part of the whole thing that you're squaring. So what I mean by that is if you kept the negative there, you need to have that squared outside. So just be mindful when you're squaring a negative, it does go. Now, here is your final answer. Just make sure that you do have this notation, f of -1. I did see f of 1. Now, that would be marked incorrect on an exam because it might look like derivative notation. So you do have to have the -1 for the inverse. Now, another common error that I saw that I don't ever want to see again was made with expanding this. Now, you don't have to ever expand unless it explicitly says to. Okay, so you just leave it in factorized form. You don't expand. Now, what students were doing when they expanded that, they were just squaring the x and then squaring the 3. So they might have had x squared minus 9 or x squared plus 9. Now, my friends, that is extremely wrong, okay? I don't want to see that ever again, all right? So be this your first and only warning to never, ever do that again, okay? So if we were squaring that, it's x minus 3 times x minus 3. So we do like the FOIL that you learnt in year 9, okay? So you don't need to expand, so there's no need to go ahead and do that unless it says to. But if you're doing this, it needs to stop, okay? Because you would get the question wrong. Even though you probably know how to do inverses, you do a silly mistake like that, and it's wrong. All right, you should also get into the habit of stating the domain, okay? So on an exam, it should say to write the domain. But just to get into that habit of thinking of what the domain is at the end of the question as well. All right, question number 2. So we're doing a bunch of transformations. So this was done really well. I'm just trying to think where students may have gone wrong. Thinking. So squaring, yeah, it was mostly with the squaring here. So I did see students not go ahead and square this, which is probably fine. You could probably leave it like that. Yeah, so that's fine. No, that question was done quite well. All right, question number 3, state the sequence of transformation. So you can read them straight from your function or your equation. Do make sure though that if you are reading it instead of mapping, that you take note of what is happening inside this bracket here. So inside that bracket, we need to rearrange it. So we've got a positive x. So you can see I've got a positive x here. So that meant I had to take that negative out. And when I took that negative out, that made that a -2. Okay, so just being careful with that. Now, you don't have to do that, but if you're going to follow DRT, you do need to do that. All right, so if you're doing transformations by inspection, you do need to do that. Now, this was done quite well, except for some students said to the left when it should have been to the right. Another transformation that occurred, which should have been after our dilation, was it was reflected in the y-axis. but the reason why I don't have it there is because it actually doesn't matter. So your parabola is symmetrical. Doesn't matter what it looks like. I might just draw a parabola. So if we reflected that in the y-axis, it's just going to look like this. It's exactly the same. Okay, so that's why you didn't have to have this transformation there, but most of you did, and technically it's not wrong. You can still have it there. It just doesn't actually change the graph, which is important to know. Okay, so keep that in mind. All right, moving on to question 4. So this was a past exam question, but it was actually from the Tech Active exam. So the first one, a lot of you got right, which was good. So your, let's just actually read the question. So state the coordinates. So you need to actually have the coordinates. There's my coordinates. I don't need to write anything else. All right, if you wrote x equals 0, x equals -1, x equals 2, not your coordinates. All right, it asks for coordinates. So if you just wrote those 0, -1, and 2, it would be wrong. You can get those coordinates straight from here. So letting that equal 0 using your null factor law, but that was done quite well. All right, part B. I think only a few of you got right. So your 3 solutions. So first of all, sorry, I was just wondering what was coming over the PA. Don't know whether you can hear it. So we're letting f of x, so f of x was at the start of the question, equal g of x, and we were just given what g of x is equal to. So our first solution is actually x equals 2. All right, so there's one solution there. So if I was to substitute in 2, I would get 0 equals 0. Now for your other solution, you can see that I've gone on to solve that. So we end up with this horrible quadratic. It's not a nice one to solve. So even though it's worth 1 mark, I left it as 1 mark because it was from exam 2, which is Tech Active, not realizing that it was actually quite a difficult one to factorize. So we end up with our 3 solutions here. Okay, so moving on. Question 5 was done really well. I was really pleased to see that people remembered how to solve exponential equations. So you always need to have the same base. So this 10 was a giveaway. So just rewriting the 100 with base 10. So when your bases are the same, you can let your powers equal each other. So you can see that's what we've done here. And then solving that, you get x equals 5. So quite an easy question compared to the previous one, although worth 2 marks. All right, question 6, sketch the graph on the axis below, labeling all asymptotes with their equations. That was done really well. I was really pleased to see that that was done. And any intercepts with their coordinates. All right, so we do need to get into the habit of writing coordinates. So you don't write 3 here, you write 0, 3. You don't write 3 on 2 here, you write 3 on 2, 0. All right, and you can see my asymptotes have been labeled and the shape of your graph. So you do have to have them in the correct quadrants, but also the shape. So remember, I've told you before about hairy graphs, so we don't want any hairy graphs, and what I mean by that is graphs that do this. All right, that would be marked wrong. Okay, so we can't have that, and we can't have graphs, sloppy graphs that go like that. All right, it's worth 3 marks. This is an easy 3 marks to get. So if you're doing sloppy graphs, like I just showed you there in black, you're going to lose marks. I mean, it doesn't take much longer for you to just go, all right, I need to go through that x-axis and I need to go close to that asymptote. I can't have a hairy graph and I can't have a dip. Okay, so just take your time. All right. It's like last night, my son and I were going to Chatty and there was this green ute and P-plater. Look, I don't want to have a go at P-platers, but he was a P-plater and he was speeding. But every red light that we got to, he was next to me. So I kept, made a good teachable moment to my son. Don't speed. All right, it doesn't get you any further. Yeah, don't draw a hairy graph. Don't draw a messy graph. Take your time. You get those marks. All right, just remember that. All right, question B was not done well. So here we got f of x is less than or equal to 1. So f of x is y. So y equals 1 is this line here. So basically we want, and I'm doing a lot of drawing here, let's highlight it in yellow. All right, we want this section of the graph here, all right, below y equals 1. Now, a lot of you were able to get this upper point here at 2, all right, so you knew 2 was there, but you didn't get that lower limit of 1. It was not negative infinity. All right, when you're doing your x values, remember you go across, and I feel like this should be in green. All right, you're going across your x-axis in this direction. So as soon as we hit the graph, all right, then that's going to be your value here. All right, so we don't hit it until we just pass that asymptote. Okay, and it's not included because your asymptote is at x equals 1. All right, moving on to question 7. So we've got this function here, or Mrs. O'Leary's office. She's going to come in soon, so if someone comes in, it's her. All right, so consider the function g of x, where d is the maximal domain, so we need to find d. So your denominator cannot equal 0. All right, so basically you're just solving this equation here. So I'm going to find d. All right, so you can't have this. You've got to have this whole thing or something similar, all right, different notation. All right, then b is pretty much just an extension of that. So your value of a is -3 on 2. Oh, sorry, so let me just go through this question. So we had g of x. Now f of x is the same as g of x, but now we're making it a one-to-one function. Okay, so before it was a truncus, so we're just now making it a one-to-one function. So a has to equal -3 on 2. State the range of f. I always find if I get stuck, I just draw a sketch, and you can see I've drawn a sketch of it there. The graph has an asymptote, or asymptotes at -3 on 2, and so that's your vertical asymptote. Your horizontal asymptote is at y equals 4, and that's because, oh, that's not the graph of f, that's the graph of g, but it's been shifted up by 4. All right, so that's why we know there's an asymptote at 4, so your range is 4 to infinity. Now, we have restricted the domain, but it doesn't actually affect the range for this one. All right, and then your inverse, so going through that, remember you switch your x and your y. I'm nearly done, and hopefully Mrs. O'Leary doesn't come in. So you're just rearranging, continuing through. I left the 1 on 2 here. I did see some people, maybe just 1 or 2, right, I might just do this in black. All right, do root 2x minus 4 minus 3 all on 2. Now there's nothing wrong with that, but you need to be able to transpose your answer if you need to. So I would say this was a little bit messy. That's why I put the half out the front. You can have the half just out the front of the square root if you wanted to. And then you have the 3 over 2 as well. So that's just expanding. All right, and we're done. And Mrs. O'Leary didn't come in. Good stuff. Bye, girls.